welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. One question that Brits in this moment could, and I think should ask, looking across to the Atlantic, is could it happen here? America right now has, over the last year, transitioned from a flawed liberal democracy to competitive authoritarianism. In this new regime, the two political parties both still exist and compete for elections, but are operating under entirely different legal and ethical regimes. The administration is openly lawless, bribery has been functionally legalised, institutions as diverse as law firms, media outlets, universities can be bullied into changing behaviour or shaken down for bribes. Legal residents are being abducted on the basis of race or nationality and sent to hastily constructed concentration camps or foreign prisons. And this is just the start. If those in power have their way, it will not stop at competitive authoritarianism. We will transition into authoritarianism proper. We already have statements from the president and other senior officials talking about getting rid of the Democratic Party. They're not yet, but they will if they can. And I think they will take us to full fascism if they are able. And that's a big if, and I am not conceding that point yet. But we should be real about where America is at. So, from the perspective of the UK, from this perspective of the EU, could it happen here? My response to that question has always been yes. Obviously it could happen here. What we are looking at is a global movement, much more so actually than liberalism, which is often held up as this global hegemonic force. Mainline liberal institutions and parties don't talk to each other globally and support each other globally in quite the same way that the foreign right does. When we look at the UK, a lot of the money and support for the increasing campaigns against, say, immigrants or trans people in this country are coming from America, to some degree coming from Russia also, which is another common thread that we've seen. There was a large, apparently 100,000 plus anti-immigrant protest in London recently, at which Elon Musk spoke and called seemingly for the violent overthrow of the US government, of the UK government, the same government, incidentally, that can't find the wherewithal to get off Elon Musk's once Twitter, now X, but that's a different story. Could it happen here? There are certainly those who are trying to make it happen here. And Reform, our far-right party, is ahead in the polls by something like 10 points as of time of recording. So I think could it happen here is a perfectly good question to ask. It's also one I've somewhat changed my mind on recently. I think I haven't been alarmist enough about this. I think the situation is actually worse than even people like me have been saying. And I'm already on, if you rank British commentators not by ideology, but by the extent they're worried about something like this, I'm already presumably on the very far edge of the spectrum. I think the median Brit, even the median Brit who thinks and talks about politics, is just not there yet. I think the general assumption is that Britain is perhaps not invulnerable to an authoritarian takeover, but not as vulnerable as the United States, certainly. I think we tend to think of ourselves as certainly a more liberal, perhaps even a more sensible country. We also don't have the long legacy of the racist holdouts of Jim Crow or something like that, nor do we have a large-scale, well-funded and organised evangelical Christian right like the US does. I mean, there's people like that here, but nothing like the same political force. Most polling shows overtly liberal attitudes a little bit lower. Also, I think internet culture has played a role in this. There's been this meme for a long time that, not even meme, a common saying for a long time that Democrats would be a centre-right party anywhere else in the world. Now, that was always a bit dubious. But I think that's added to the sense that America is just a bit further right to us. And also, we say in a self-congratulatory way, aren't the British just a bit more grounded, a bit more dignified, a bit less conspiratorial than those, those less dignified Yanks? If you add all that up, what you have is a bunch of vibes and half-true statements. If you try and think through it in a more sustained analytic way, I think where you end up is not only is the UK very much at risk, we are actually more at risk than America. Much more. It will be worse here. Here's something I did that really pushed me even further towards that conclusion. It's a commonplace in the United States to measure political candidates or parties sort of on a grading spectrum. The NRA, the Guns Rights Advocacy Group, does this, and they'll give politicians a letter grade. So like an A would represent very strong on the Second Amendment, according to them. And it's sort of like a bit of a marker for who to support in primaries or general elections or so on. Okay, if gun rights are important to me, then this gives me a grade to base my vote off of. I started thinking, I haven't seen, and I would like to see, something a bit like that for Democrats, but for how aggressively they're opposing an attempted fascist takeover. So I started thinking about this just in the US case, but then I thought, I wonder what would happen if you ran the same thing in the UK. But let me show you the model I created for the US first, because even in itself, this is kind of interesting, because I think this is basically what we should be asking of our politicians. I think this is the most important thing we can be asking of our politicians. Beyond like a few clear red line issues, I would probably vote for how actively a Democrat is opposing fascism more than I would, strictly are they of my exact tribe or issue alignment. So this is what I came up with. These things I'm not really taking as for themselves, but the extent to which they act as signifiers for or heuristics of them taking the fight against fascism seriously. So I've got prosecuting GOP criminality. This is actually something none of the Democrats I scored did particularly well on. If, say, Elon Musk and Doge, this kind of fell apart, but he's coming and seizing data in violation of the law and is hacking into systems in violation of the law, then he should be arrested. I'm a bit sick of Democrats calling for investigations. Like, yes, there should be an investigation, but handcuffs on, please. Like, what would happen to me if I hacked into the IRS database and stole everyone in the country's personal data? Okay, whatever the answer to that question is, that's what should happen to the people in Doge, right? Court reform. Any path back to anything resembling liberal democracy runs through the current Supreme Court. They have been part of, I think we can talk about them as having gone along with Trump. No, they have been an active part of an authoritarian coup, and they have shown this again and again and again, and they are an active enforcer of the system I described earlier as competitive authoritarianism, right? Now, I'm not particular on what that solution looks like, but I think court expansion is the more aggressive solution that I've heard. And again, whether or not that's exactly what we do, I think that's a good marker for, is a politician taking this seriously? Procedural aggressiveness could cover a number of things, from gerrymandering, adding states, ending the filibuster, being obstructionist, using state powers to block the Trump administration, but bracket category. Next point, ending ICE. I think we cannot move forward into a truly liberal regime with the secret police of an authoritarian one still hanging around. That just has to end. Trans rights, I included not so much for the issue itself, though I agree with it and think it's very important, but because I think that's one of the main front lines right now. And it's a good heuristic for if a politician is willing to talk out of both sides of their mouth on this, it's a good heuristic for do they think fascism can be compromised with? Do they think they can appease it? Do they think they can say, okay, we'll give up the rights of one minority, and then the rest of us will be safe? There's both a moral element, you shouldn't do that, but there's also, I think, just a strategic element there, in that's, if in the year of our Lord 2025, you think the MAGA movement can be calmed down by a few compromises on women's sports, then you're just not living in reality. And I think that's a good heuristic to put to politicians of, are they living in the world as it exists? Finally, this one's kind of become more important to me. It might be less important to others. I like politicians who use the F word. Like, will they call it fascism? Right? And some do and some don't in the Democrats, and I'm willing to award points for that. And finally, to the extent to which I think one of the things people have responded well to with Democrats is when they've taken personal risks themselves, when they've put their bodies on the line in protests or flown to El Salvador to visit someone illegally deported in Senator Van Hollen's case, right? So I added all that up into a model. Now, these points reflect my judgment of what I think Democrats should be doing, what I think primary electorates should be asking of their representatives. And as I say, like, just a sort of set of heuristics for, like, are they taking it seriously, right? These reflect my judgment, and you could certainly argue with me on them. Nonetheless, I think it's a starting point, right? Now, what I then tried to do was apply them in a reasonably objective way. So I took a sampling of, I think I'm up to now 15 significant Democrats, and if I'm giving one person points for a statement on something, I need to give this another person points, the same number of points for the same statement. So now that I have my model, I'm applying it objectively. And I created some grade boundaries. I've slightly, from when I first published this, normalised so that it's consistent with how I graded UK politicians, because this is where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to create a measure for how seriously I think Dems are taking this, and then create an equivalent measure for the UK. But let's just do the Dems first. So awarding points across all of those categories, let's just go through and have a quick look at how people score. Let's start with Chuck Schumer. D-. I actually moved him up a bit from an F. I gave him a couple of more points for procedural aggressiveness. Also, I'm normalising against how I assigned points in the UK. A few points for willing to do the shutdown, stuff like that. He gets points for being consistently pro-trans rights. He hasn't called Trump fascist. He maybe would go along with court reform, but he hasn't spoken out for it in any sort of aggressive way. He hasn't called for the arrest of administration officials. He hasn't called for ending ICE. He's called for it to be reformed, so I gave him a couple of points there. But just a weak score overall. Very similar story for Hakeem Jeffries. He scores slightly higher than Schumer in a couple of areas, but I think for the legislative leadership, they're very much in the following their party rather than leading it camp. I'm just going to go through all of these because I thought it was interesting. Next up is Pritzker. He's been a hero of many for his response to the federal guard. I'm trying to do this in one take. For the troops being sent into his state. He definitely got points for that. Also for being pro-trans rights, and also for making overt comparisons to Nazi Germany, so he gets those categories. He needs to move up a boundary. He's a passing grade, but to move up, he would need to more explicitly call for prosecutions and the end of ICE and court reform. Newsom, perhaps surprisingly, also a lower grade. He gets points for procedural aggressiveness for his gerrymander, but then loses points in many of the other categories. Bernie was my most mixed. He gets a lot of points, for instance, for having voted against the creation of ICE and always been against its existence. So on ending ICE, he's a 10 out of 10, fair's fair. But he then loses a lot of points, for instance, for having opposed court expansion in the 2020 race. Bernie's a bit all over the shop with regards to this. Some people who don't like Bernie were sort of commenting like, well, how can Bernie get a C when all he ever does is snipe at Democrats? Well, because, like I said, he's consistently called for the end of ICE. Like, I'm grading fairly to my criteria here. But he's in the middle. AOC. AOC gets an A- because across the board. Called for end of ICE. Let me just see what I've got for him. Yeah, names it as fascism, pro-trans rights, procedurally aggressive, pro-court reform. Could do more on calling for the prosecution of criminality, honestly. All of them could. But she's sort of, in terms of just at least adopting these positions, and people will say there's a difference between adopting them and really meaning it. Sure, I'm trying to be objective here, so I'm just going by statements and votes. I look at length and strength of support, but I'm not making any evaluation of sincerity. Just are people saying the right stuff? Warren's a B. Model likes her for very similar reasons that it likes AOC. Slightly lower in some areas. Hochul, D-. Similar story to Newsom. Points for a gerrymander, not so strong in the other categories. Van Hollen is the senator who I mentioned who took a trip to El Salvador to visit Alberto Garcia in prison there. He gets points for that. He could be stronger on stuff like court reform. Just bashing through a few sort of centre of the party people. Adam Schiff, who was one of the main people on the investigations into January 6th, he gets a C+. Ron Wyden, C-. Buttigieg. I like Buttigieg. I wanted him to score higher. I think the party needs smart young people. He just isn't as far along as some of the others. Unlike he's talked about court reform, but I had to score what he said lower because it just wasn't anywhere near as aggressive as what some of the others have said. Likewise with Harris. She's signalled openness to a lot of this stuff, but not overtly said, this is what I want to see happen. And, maybe that's a bit unfair to her. VP is a bit of a weird position, so maybe that reflects Biden in. Nonetheless, just judging her on the position she's taken, that's what she got. I'll do two more real quick. People requested Chris Murphy. He's a D. Honestly, not surprising. He reads fine on paper, but he's made a number of slightly stupid statements, and so a D for him doesn't surprise me. Jayapal, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, I believe. She's an A-, exactly the same score as AOC, and for largely the same reasons. Consistently against ICE, very, very strong record on trans rights, overtly called the administration fascist, and she's where she needs to be on court reform. Again, for all of them, if people break the law, be it administration officials or ICE agents, I want to see them arrested. I don't want to see calls for investigations or when we take back power, we'll have them before the such and such committee and give them what for. I think we should enforce the laws as they are, and this to me isn't a vengeance thing or even a justice thing. I named the regime type we're under as competitive authoritarianism. One of the key features of that, probably arguably the key feature of that, is a differential legal standard between the different factions. Like, if a Democrat would be arrested for doing something, a Republican should be. It's about restoring the universal rule of law, which is one of the key ineliminatable features of liberal democracy. So they all score a bit weak for that. Nonetheless, A minus. That gives you, by the way, if you're sort of keeping track, an average grade of a C, a strong C, like a C plus, for the Democrats I surveyed. And while that's hardly an exhaustive list, I'm one guy with a Google search. I'm not like the Southern Poverty Law Centre or something here. I think that's a fair reflection of the different branches of the party. C plus overall, but with quite a lot of variation within that. And my first thoughts were that's a bit scary, because these are the things I think everyone in the party needs to be signed off on. And, we're sort of at like 55%, On the other, if you want to be glass half full, there is the 55% that's there, and I think the wind's clearly blowing in our favour, our here being people who want to fight, who want to oppose this with everything we've got. I think if you'd run this same model 4 years ago, the results would have been much worse. I think there'd have been a lot more like D's and F's in it. So the Democrats have come a long way, and there's a lot of them that are very good, that are, some people have said my model doesn't go far enough because it's only really measuring professed belief. But, that's not nothing. So that's where the Dems are. And I thought, okay, well, that's an interesting little model. Some people said, oh, I like the idea of this. It's sort of good to try and be a bit more, if not completely objective, a bit more rigorous about it and actually assigning scores and doing a bit of math rather than just going on vibes. Some people said, to address a potential criticism, well, why are you ranking Dems and criticising our team when the country is on fire? I hear that. Let's avoid friendly fire if we possibly can. I hear that. I do. I think what I would say is, while we should be very careful not to blame the Democrats for the situation, I think we still do need to ask of them to be as aggressive in fighting this as they can be. And I don't think it's unreasonable when, say, casting a ballot in a primary election, which there might be between two people who scored quite differently, to look at something like this as like a heuristic for how to vote. And I also think, mainline liberals can often get a bit frustrated, and I think correctly so, with progressives yelling at Democrats to sort of quote-unquote do something. Republicans just overturned Roe. Why aren't Democrats doing something? And because a lot of the time the answer is they are, or a lot of the time the answer is it's not clear what they could do, right? And so what I wanted to do with this was not just yell do something, to sort of say this is the things I think Democrats should be doing. And, I'm going to try and fairly apply it to who is and who isn't doing those things. And so, for instance, if Chuck Schumer wanted to move upgrades, he needs to call for the expansion of the court and dismantling ICE. Like anyone can move up, right? It's not about who I vibe with personally. And it's not about just yelling at Dems for the sake of it. It's the idea is to be constructive. So that's sort of to address that criticism of, I hear you about not shouting too hard at your own side, but this is meant to be a calling in, not a calling out, as it were. This is about who is fighting hardest for our side and recognising and validating that, not on bashing the side. Okay? But, again, if you want to be glass half full, the Democrats have come a long way, and there's a lot of positive stuff in there that we can talk about. Some less positive, but a lot of positive. And then I thought, and I posted, this would be so grim. This would be so so grim to run the same analytic in the UK. And then once I had that thought, I thought, well, they'd all just get Fs. And then I thought, well, I have to do it now, right? Now, obviously, our Supreme Court, well, that's actually a bit of a different story. But some of this will be America specific. So I decided, okay, let's create a UK version. Here it is. I called it resistance to fascism here, because we don't quite use the word resistance in the same way. And honestly, this is easier. This is an easier standard to meet than what I was imposing on. To be fair to the Democrats, I am asking lifelong institutionalists to make deeply radical institutional changes. I think they need to, I think they have to, I think that's the right ask of them. But like people who've believed their whole life in the Supreme Court to blow up the Supreme Court, I think that is the ask we have to make. But that is a heavy lift, I get it, right? I get why there would be an instinctual reluctance from some people. All I'm really asking in the case of my UK list is, will they name it and oppose it? So I'm doing same boundaries, same scoring criterion, slightly different categories. So will they call Reform fascist? That's our far-right party. I even awarded points for racist or far-right, right? And I'm trying to be consistent, right, with how I scored Democrats. So I scored Democrats, really, would they use the F word, or would they make comparisons to Nazi Germany, right? So, there's some, so Starmer said, some of Reform's policies are racist, but wouldn't call the leader, Nigel Farage, personally racist. How many points would I give a Democrat for saying some of Trump's policies are racist, but the man himself isn't? Not many, right? So I just tried to be consistent. Also, because I think this is global, will they call the Trump administration fascist? Easy way to get points. Do they connect reform to global fascism? And again, I think this is an easy pickup for our mainline politicians in the UK. So when Elon Musk is talking to crowds of racists in London, arguing for the overthrowing of the UK state, are our politicians saying this is part of a global fascist conspiracy? Fascism is on the rise across the world. What is happening with Trump, with Orban, with Putin, that is what we are seeing here. This is not a homegrown thing. This is something that is being imported by malicious foreign elites. Are they making that case, right? Next one, do they draw a values contrast on immigration? What I mean by this is when Reform says we will deport refugees to the Taliban, do we say, oh, well, that's not a practical plan, and there's all sorts of complications with it, they haven't thought it through or costed it properly? Or do we, this is morally heinous? This is not who we are as a country. We are a liberal country that believes in accepting refugees and believes in the rule of law, and believes that our country is not made worse by those things, it's made stronger by them. Right? Now, those things aren't mutually exclusive. Something can be both morally heinous and not thought through, as is indeed the case with most of Reform's strategies. But I'm not asking, do they merely say that, I'm asking how. Do they, in addition to saying that it's not costed or not thought through, draw that values contrast? Support trans rights exactly the same as in the US. I'm using this as a heuristic for do they think they can appease fascism? I think, maybe that's not one for one, but I think it's a pretty good marker. And in the UK's case, I gave points for how coalitional they are. This can take a number of forms. So, for instance, in the part of smaller parties, will they cooperate to work through the electoral system that we have? Do they call for the electoral system itself to be changed so that we might not get a fascist majority with 31% of the vote or whatever? Are they willing to work with other parties? Open-ended, but are they willing to come, because our party system is much more fractured, are they willing to come together with others to oppose the danger of the far right? Are they willing to deprioritise their own immediate interests in order to have a popular front against fascism, right? And again, bonus points for having taken personal risks like Van Hollen did. So that was my criteria. Let's just do this quickly because this is a bit depressing. Keir Starmer, F. I mean, he doesn't score in any of them, really, does he? Will he call Reform fascist? No. Will he call Trump fascist? No. Does he connect it to global fascism? Not really. Is he willing to draw a values contrast? No. The criticism of Reform's policies has almost exclusively come in that, oh, they're not practical, they're not workable. Pro-trans, I had to just, give him 0 on this because he's implemented a very, very authoritarian bathroom ban. Like, if I'm giving Democrats 7 or 8 out of 10 for just not being hostile to trans people, I have to give Starmer 0 here, right? Is he coalitional in his approach to defeating fascism? Manifestly not. He's ruled out any sort of voting reform. So this is why I slightly upgraded a couple of my US ones, because it just didn't convey the extent to which even the lowest Dems are significantly above even the highest Labour people, right? Leader of the opposition, F, obviously. Ed Miliband was the highest scoring of the Labour people I looked at. He had quite a good conference speech in which he did make the connections to global fascism in the way that I would want, and he got points for that. But then, again, can I award any points for being pro-trans rights to a member of a government that has implemented a bathroom ban that is not only more authoritarian than any Democrat? Even, this is miles beyond the worst Democrat. I gave Gavin Newsom 3 out of 10 for trans rights, because, he says he supports them, but then he said stupid stuff about women's sports, right? If Newsom gets 3, then anyone in Labour has to get 0, right? This is to the right, not just of Democrats, but many Republicans. Less radical bathroom bills have been vetoed by Republican governors, right? So that has to be 0. Coalition has to be 0. Won't call Reform fascist directly. I gave him some points for calling them racist, even. But again, it's just not enough to clear the F boundary. Imposing the standard of a median Democrat and holding them to that standard is just brutal. And I was at first thinking there's no point in even doing this because they'll all just get Fs. And then I was like, well, that in itself kind of is telling. Judging Labour by the standard of a median Democrat is a standard that they can't meet. Andy Burnham, also someone who's talked about as a progressive alternative to Starmer. He might be somewhat better on some core issues in terms of a clear commitment to anti-fascism. F. Rachel Reeves, F. Lib Dem leader Ed Davey gets us out of the nosebleeds. Let me see his scoring. Little bit better on drawing values contrasts with Reform. More clearly willing to say, we're a diverse country and that's good. He still went along with the bathroom ban. Hasn't really named the Trump administration for what it is. So, maybe a bit better, but not world-beating. Corbyn. Also, I thought Corbyn might have been better, but Corbyn can be very aggressive about the economic stuff and cool. Actually, on drawing a values contrast on immigration, on trans rights, on stuff like this, he's not. He may be a bit better than the current government. He scored a shade higher than Starmer, but he's actually not that good on this. Zara Sultana, I upgraded a bit because someone pointed me in the way of some statements she'd made that were calling the racist riots that we saw fascist. That I feel is an incredibly low bar, but it's one many of our national leaders can't compete with. But, so cool, D+. John Swinney, Scottish First Minister. Again, I wanted to give him points for trans rights because actually historically the SNP has been one of the better parties on this. They did attempt to update gender recognition in Scotland some time ago, but again he's sort of gone along with the bathroom ban. So again, judged by the standard of the median Democrat, I just can't award that many points there. I did give Swinney more for drawing a clear values contrast. He said very clearly, immigrants make our country stronger. Refugees are welcome here. We absolutely oppose. I don't think he's called them fascist, but he has called them racist. So on the pluralism and immigration side of things, he's been a bit stronger. And finally, Zach Polanski, the Green Party leader, are one passing grade. I didn't mean this to be like an advert for the Green Party, but fair's fair. He's been very pro-trans rights. He's spoken out against the bathroom ban. He has at least signalled openness to being coalitional. I mean, the devil's always in the detail with that stuff, but I'm just going by statements. He said, for instance, that with Corbyn and Sultana's new party, that he'd be open to sort of looking at them splitting seats between them or something. Again, devil's in the details, but at least he said it, right? He's connected it to global fascism, and he actually called Trump a fascist, right? So he actually scores pretty well by British standards, or average to somewhat above average by Democratic ones. Average grade for Dems was a C+. Average grade across the spectrum for any non-fascist party in the UK, an F. So what do we do with that? This is what I said, and this is why I started with the question, and I'm going to end with this as my sort of final thoughts. I've been saying for some time now, the Labour Party is now worse than the Democratic Party on both social and economic issues. I think running through this from the point of view not exactly of issue support, but robustness of their opposition to fascism, which I think sort of correlate, but not exactly. I think generally centrists have been worse, but there's been, in the US case, there's been some centrists who've been decent. There's certainly been the odd decent anti-Trump Republican. Likewise with progressives, I think we have more Warrens and AOCs and so on, but Bernie's been mixed. I think certainly once you get into progressive commentators, there's many who've said deeply unhelpful things. So it's not one for one, and I think it's useful to just isolate the opposition to fascism variable, and judged by that alone, it is stark. Like, it is really stark how much worse the UK is. And I think this has made a difference. I think for all that I would love to see a Democratic Party that was scoring A's across the board, if we had a party that was scoring A's across the board, we might not have been here, or we might be in at least a much stronger position now. But the fact that they were at least scoring points, there has been an organised opposition to Trump. People say the Democrats haven't done anything to oppose him. That's not fair, and it's not true. It took, a whole first term of Trump really grinding away against the guardrails to be where we are now. We're just speed running this, It's taken the fascist right, considering that the antecedents of this go back significantly prior to Trump. You have like birtherism, which obviously Trump was associated with. You have the Tea Party. You have like cultural stuff like Gamergate. We're almost 2 decades into this now, right? It's taken 2 decades to do what the British far right has done in 2-3 years, and that's what, people say, oh, if only liberalism wasn't so loud and annoying, this is what it looks like when liberalism just caves. Oh, if only liberalism stopped with all that trans rights and gender weirdness. Okay, This is what it looks like when we abandon it altogether. We are just speedrunning this. We are already in a position where, with respect to some freedoms and the rights of some minorities, we are in a worse position, functionally and practically, with a Labour government in the UK than we are without an out-and-out fascist in the White House, right? Your rights and freedoms as a trans person are better in, certainly in blue states and even some red ones, than they are increasingly in the UK, right? And the rest of it, the corruption, the unequal legal regime, the mass deportations, reform's already proposing this. You know, they're already catching up, not to where Trump was in 2016, but where he was in 2024, right? And, you know, if people, the entire Trump era, have been calling on liberalism to stand down, abandon immigrants, abandon trans rights, just don't be as vocal, don't be as loud, don't set them off, don't provoke them, based on, in my view, a flawed theory of what is causing fascism in the first place. Here's your trial case. Now, it's always been tricky with the Democrats, because the Democrats are a mix of lefties, mainline liberals, reactionary centrists, and the party's overall messaging is a bit of a muddle between those approaches. So it's kind of hard to assign causality and say whose approach is working, because the Democrats have kind of been trying to do all of them at once. The UK, this is what happens when it's just reactionary centrists, or kind of useless lefties, with a couple of honourable exceptions. When there is no organised pushback, there's no one saying, actually, immigration's a good thing, or actually, trans people aren't hurting anyone, can we leave them alone? This is what it looks like. And there's been a thing over the last 20 years in America where people have always said, oh, I never thought it would be that bad. And actually, we've been perpetually catching up to where we are, instead of drawing the trend line and saying, if it continues this way, this is where we will be. If we start doing that in the UK, we have not caught up to where we are yet. I think the vast majority of Brits, the vast majority of political commentators have not really clocked how hard to the right we have lurched and how authoritarian we already are. But I think if you go further and draw a trend line to think, where might we be soon? I think you can reach some very alarming conclusions very quickly with very little imagination. Now, just how good are our top-level politicians on the non-fascist side is not the whole part of the story. There are many other things we could look at here, but I have a sinking feeling that if we tried to be even quasi-objective and analytic about it in the way that I was, quasi-objective and analytic about it in the case of ranking our politicians, I suspect you would find the comparison is also not in the UK's favour. So let's have a think about a few of them. Our media. I have complained a lot about the American media. There are a lot of reactionary centrists in it. If the media could have behaved more responsibly, we would not be here. If they did not give the amount of coverage to Hillary's emails as they did all of Trump's scandals combined, we would not be here. But at least they reported on Trump's scandals. Our press right now, our right-wing press is just in the tank for fascism at this point, but even our supposedly mainstream and liberal press are really just hyping reform up. They are giving them a lot of coverage and very little either on the way of enforcing norms and values on them, or in the way of holding them to some sort of minimum factual standard. There's just, I don't want to say there's nothing, there is some. There is some, but it's not as good. Eyeballing this, I think you'd see that there's less in the UK. More than that, our party system is another one that you might compose it to. Our liberal vote is much more fractured. Now, people like to complain about the Democrats in the States. And I think a lot of people sort of say to me, one question I've got, or criticism even, is when I say, yeah, you just have to vote Democrat. Don't care if you don't love them personally, you have to vote Democrat. They say, is there no red line that they could pass that would lose you their support? And I think I can very confidently say there are. I mean, I don't think we're there yet in the case of Democrats. I think, like not being a fascist when there is a fascist on the ballot is a pretty strong argument, and the Democrats are all right. You know, they're a normal centre of the left party. But I can say for a fact that there are red lines that would lose my support, because Labour has marched through those red lines. And it has lost my support. And have you seen what I write about the British Labour Party? Right? Like, I am not a mindless cheerleader for whoever the centre-left leadership turns out to be. I just think that's the best bet in the US. So yeah, if the Democrats started doing stuff like implementing authoritarian bathroom bans and posting videos of deportations in a gleeful way like Labour is, and indulging and validating the absolute worst values of the far right. Yeah, if the Democrats did all of that, I would withdraw my support. But here's the thing I'd really want to stress, and here's what the UK really shows. That is not a position you should want to be in. Right? I think a lot of people want to say, oh, well, is there any red lines, any ethical red lines for Dems? You know, mine as a mainline liberal might be a bit different to yours as a member of the anti-establishment left, but yes, I have my red lines. Here's what I would want to say, though. We should not want to march through them, because where that leaves the anti-fascist resistance in the UK is in an absolute strategic nightmare. Like, there's as many votes on our side as there are on theirs, but how we push those votes through like 4 different parties through a first-past-the-post system, I don't have a great answer for that right now, right? Other than try to cast the most strategically anti-fascist vote that you can in your constituency. But what that is may very well not be clear, right? You might be in a sort of 4-way runoff. Like, we're not. Hopefully, the election will be a few years ago, but we are in such a worse strategic position because of that. Up next, checks and balances. Now, I have long, over a decade now, been a critic of this idea that in America, oh, the system will have the system has guardrails, there's checks and balances. Even if someone dangerous like Trump gets into office, he won't be able to do anything. That, to me, has seemed wrong, and obviously wrong. Guardrails and institutional checks are only as good as the willingness of people in the system to use them. And if you degrade them over time, or if you put people in positions of power who won't use them, i.e. the current Supreme Court, who will let clearly ineligible people run for president, or who will declare them immune from prosecution, or who will greenlight deportations, or who will say they will not actively enforce birthright citizenship. You know, again, there's the piece of paper that says those things, but unless the people in the core engine room of governance are willing to pull those levers, then the bit of paper isn't worth that much, right? That's been my position. At least the US has that bit of paper. At least it has different sets of institutions with countervailing powers, and that has slowed it. It's not stopped it, but it has slowed it, right? The Dems, for all that I think they could have done more, have obstructed. They have slowed it down. They have pushed back. States, the fact that there's federalism in the US has enabled blue governors to stand up to it more. I think, like I said, the whole Trump first term was him sort of chewing through, working around these constraints, trying to work out where the weak points would be. It slowed it. It got us another term. It got us to the point where we could have a free and fair election, get him out of power, and then rebuild, and we squandered that chance. Democrats squandered it by, and the judicial system, to be fair, squandered it by not getting prosecutions in for Trump and the key people, and then the electorate and the media squandered it by kind of just forgetting all about it and bringing Trump back, right? So, and now that we are here, the checks and balances are not saving us, right? But they did buy us time. You know, I don't want to say just because I've really been an opponent of this idea that the guardrails will hold, because they're clearly not, right? I don't want to say the guardrails are useless, right? You've got to have both a lever and someone willing to pull it. The UK has neither. We don't have people who really seem to even be able to name and oppose what we're facing, but we also just don't have the levers. We do not have constitutional review. The weirdness with the 4 women trans case notwithstanding, but no, we don't. And in fact, right now, there is a very, very aggressive push in the UK to remove us from the European Court of Human Rights, which would take us out of one of the very, very, very few legal checks on the system that we do have. And not only is Reform calling for this, not only are the Tories calling for this, Starmer is flirting with it. I said in a previous piece of mine, if the goal of our centrist politicians and centrist press was to ensure that their fascist replacements had all of the tools they needed to govern on day one, it is difficult to see what they would do differently. There's no federalism in the UK either. I mean, yeah, we have devolved assemblies. We have the Scottish Parliament has quite a lot of power, but again, they can just be overridden by the UK Parliament. We don't have this sort of constitutional grinding gears, you know. And I've been a critic of that overly formalistic approach in the US, but again, there was something there. There is nothing here, right? So try and map all that forward. Our leading politicians, through really the whole of the spectrum, I'll give an honourable exemption to the Greens, but like, you know, could they win a general election? How does that work with first past the post voting? I'm not going to even attempt to solve that here. Our leading politicians, the best of them, are maybe on a par with the worst Democrats. Like that differential was stark. And I knew it was going to be stark when I sort of ran that experiment, and I was still shocked by just how stark it was. There's no checks and balances. Our media is worse, and our party system and electoral structures put us in an infinitely bleaker strategic position. Map that forward. I've been saying for some time that our next election might be 2016 in America. It might be the equivalent of that, Hillary v. Trump. Uninspiring centrist versus out-and-out fascist, and we just haven't taken the fascist thing seriously, and we set ourselves down that road. I think I was wrong. I think it's going to be 2024. It's going to be a point of no return, at which, if we take that path, we will go to competitive authoritarianism, we will keep going down the path, and we will not be able to get back. And what's worse, once we start that slide in the UK, there is just nothing standing in its way. There is nothing. No structured institutional opposition, no coherent resistance, no loud voices of opposition in the press, no guardrails, no institutional checks, no procedural levers that you could pull, even if there were people willing to pull them. Once we start that slide, there is nothing. We have only a few years to work out how we avoid that. Because if we do that, and we are already sliding, but if we empower a fascist government we want, I don't think we will come back. And we have to be realistic and ready for that. Thanks for listening.